Hello and welcome to Temporal, part of the podcast series with Ahval News Online, a trilingual independent news site on Turkey. Our guest today is Emma Sinclair-Webb, Turkey Director of Human Rights Watch. Yesterday, Human Rights Watch issued its regular world report on the state of human rights globally, where Turkey has, due to continuing dramatic developments on the area, has once more its prominent part. We will discuss the details of the report, focusing on Turkey. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Ms. Sinclair-Webb.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, the report is, as expected, quite prominent, and there are some headlines or titles because it is such a wide area where you cover and shed light on. What happened in the past year. There is the parts on state of emergency and after freedom of expression, and also human rights defenders' situation, Kurdish conflict and crackdown on opposition, and torture and ill treatment, refugees and migrants. Can you walk us through in general how it looks, first of all, an overall picture, bird's eye, what's been happening in Turkey?
Well, the bird's eye is, of course, we're reflecting back on the past year in this report. So we try to be current and look at continuing trends, of course. But looking back over the past year, what do we see? Well, we see that the elections happened back in June. And then the presidential system, which has insufficient checks and balances on executive power, came fully into force with those elections back in June, with President Erdogan again being re-elected president, but with the full new powers, and also gaining control of the parliament through a coalition. We then saw that the state of emergency last year was lifted in July. And I think internationally there was an expectation or a hope that with the end of state of emergency, we would see significant changes in Turkey, an easing, perhaps, of the very repressive atmosphere. I think that might look naive now to have expected that to happen, but I think it's understandable that the UN, the EU, and countries around Europe had at least to voice that expectation, that end of state of emergency would see some kinds of improvements. But unfortunately, of course, that did not happen. And we saw an continuingly extremely repressive atmosphere after the lifting of state of emergency.
Let's focus on the state of emergency and after its consequences and where it's at. I think what distinguishes Human Rights Watch from the other reports that I have seen, at least, that you went through the numbers of those who are affected by the measures under the state of emergency, and there's a breakdown of numbers. And this is an interesting update. Can you explain how you methodologically reached these numbers and what those numbers are and what they mean?
Sure. I think, what we try to do with reports like this is to draw on official data as much as possible, and to look at, the cumulative number of people dismissed under the state of emergency, for example. So we come up with a figure of about 130,000 people dismissed under state of emergency decrees. Other people were dismissed without decrees. So judges and prosecutors were dismissed by the Council of Judges and Prosecutors. They weren't dismissed by decrees. So we haven't included those figures in the 130,000. And there are others dismissed as well from their professions and from public service by other means. So the figure is higher than the figure we state. But we're trying here to put in, the minimum figures that we can come across. And I think the other very, very striking statistic in this report is that in June 2018, the Justice Ministry announced figures about prison numbers, which they periodically do. And we haven't got the latest update, and I'll return to this in a minute. But in June last year, the prison population which was around 250,000, had among the people, among the 250,000, or I think it was actually, sorry, it was 246,000, among that group, 1/5, that's 20%, so 48,924 people were in prison for terrorism offences. Now, there are very few countries in the world that I think have a prison population, or have 20% of its prison population somehow charged for terrorism offences. Some of those are convicted, and some of those people are remand prisoners. But that seemed to me a very stunning figure. And I would like to give an update on that now. In November 2018, the Justice Minister at the Planning Commission meeting in the Parliament gave an update on numbers of people in prison. And the figure of terror suspects, terror defendants, had gone down slightly, but it had gone down to being 17% of the prison population. So I think that's an important figure to sort of bear in mind and to carry with us when we think about Turkey. Of course, it doesn't at all, it doesn't represent the number of people on trial for terrorism, which is much, much higher. We're just purely looking at those who are held in pre-trial detention or have got convictions or first instance court convictions for terrorism.
Okay, so roughly 50,000, slightly less.
Yeah.
And the figure given in the report is 34,240. Let's say 34,000 to make the listeners understand roughly, where are being held for alleged Gülenist, what the authorities call FETÖ links, which amount to roughly 70%, 65-70% of those who are being held behind bars on terrorist charges, and 10,286 for alleged links to the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, and 1,270 for alleged links to the extremist Islamic State, ISIS groups. So the majority is overwhelmingly linked to Gülenist segment.
That's correct.
And this is, does this include also the officers and soldiers, the Turkish Armed Forces personnel held in jail? Are they counted within the segment of Gülenists, or is that a separate category?
I think they are counted within the Gülenists segment, but it's worth coming back to the figures of number of officers and soldiers, military personnel on trial, and civilians too on trial for actual involvement. Yeah, so within the category of the around 34,000 from June last year who were held in prison for terrorism crimes suspected to be Gülenist-linked, FETÖ membership being the principal charge, you've also got continuing trials against, within that group, people who were actually suspected of being involved in the coup. And to date, back in by June last year, there were about 2,177 defendants had been convicted at first instance in court cases for the coup. And another 1,552 had been acquitted. And there are some continuing trials there, and these trials have not been finalized yet. But it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, when we look at all these figures, there are many other people who've been released from prison and are still on trial for terrorism membership. And those people, the prison is a revolving door in a way. You've got people going in and out of prison. So these figures change all the time and are not the sum of the number of people in Turkey on trial for terrorism.
Do you see any trend of judicial processes speeding up, or is it the same level?
I think some judicial processes in Turkey are happening very fast, in fact. And yes, for years we've complained about very slow proceedings. But on the other hand, there is a danger, too, in having very fast proceedings, which are done very badly. So where evidence isn't looked at properly. just in the interests of galloping to the first decision, the court actually doesn't hear witnesses, doesn't accept lawyers' requests for examination, further examination of evidence, further expert witness reports, especially further examination of digital material that's considered as evidence. And we sometimes get into a situation where trials, actually, some of them are very speeded up, given the severity of the charges. A badly done quick trial that results in a conviction is obviously not a just way forward either. So, though we've complained for years of long, drawn out trial proceedings, my concern these days is also that trial proceedings are getting to be very poorly done, a very inadequate treatment of evidence.
During this period, the presidential decrees were, of course, of big importance. There was a commission to review the dismissals of more than 130,000 public officials. And this commission is at work, but complaints are sky high about the way the commission works. We are talking about complaints level as of 2017 or maybe the beginning of 2018. Decisions were issued about 36,000 cases. Very few, 2,300, reinstated their jobs, but at least nearly 90,000 appeals are to be reviewed. Does this commission have any meaning for those who feel badly or negatively affected by that?
I think the problem with the commission, of course, the commission is another moving staircase, because in our report we say that they made decisions in 36,000 cases. That number's gone up since this report. It's more than that. But what is very striking is that there's a very, very high rejection rate. So people have appealed to the commission, and the vast majority, all but 3%, basically have their appeal rejected. So they're not being reinstated in their jobs. Very, very few people. I believe the figure is, up to 5%, perhaps less, reinstated. So that's, a very low level of acceptance. That basically the commission stands behind these very hastily made decree decisions to sack all these people. And, what we have to remember about this commission, of course, is that the very same authorities that fired the people in the first place are essentially charged with examining whether they should be reinstated or not. So it's not an independent commission, and it's not clear what the criteria is that might get used to weigh up your application. So, basically, Amnesty International has reported this rather well, that a lot of the appeal decisions are the old criteria yet again, which is all about bylock use and Bank Asia, a bank account, those sort of criteria, and family relationships, and then unspecified criteria. We just don't know what the criteria was. The decisions are very varied from each other, so it's very difficult to draw general conclusions.
In accordance with the European Union reform process, which is now frozen, there is an ombudsman office in Turkey. Did it have any effect at all, or any role at all in making things better for in terms of democracy?
Of course, the Ombudsman's office in principle is a very important institution, because ombudsman or ombudsperson's role is to look at misconduct by state officials, to look at injustices committed by public authorities against citizens. And the ombudsman role in Turkey just is not playing the function that it might play in trying to tackle this vast web of injustice that we've seen over the past few years.
Another category is, of course, as highlighted by professional organizations internationally, is the situation of the journalists. Numbers vary, but it varies between at least 90 through 200, over 200 journalists kept in jail, some of them sentenced to heavy prison sentences, such as Ahmet Altan, Nazlı Ilıcak, to aggravated lifetime. What is the findings of the report in general and short about their situation?
Well, yes. I mean, we basically give the figure. We estimate in this report we were estimating 175 journalists and media workers held in pre-trial detention or serving sentences in prison. We include media workers, and I think it's important to mention this. We include them because there are a lot of people in prison who've been targeted for being associated with certain media groups. So they may not be writers or broadcasters themselves, journalists in the classic sense, but they work in the media and they're penalized for their role in the media in all sorts of different functions. So we do include them in our figures, which some media groups don't. Some media groups are more purist and they only look at people who really write or really are anchor people on television, really are journalists in a more classic sense. I think the general trend is that journalists, like everybody else, are hounded with terrorism charges. This terrorism charge, which is the general theme of probably this whole chapter, is so overused, it's so abused, that all sorts of activities which could not amount to terrorism in any reasonable sense get regarded as terrorism, and that ranges across a spectrum from propaganda to aiding and abetting to full membership of an illegal organization. And these charges are pressed against lots of journalists, as they are against lots of other people. Wouldn't want to just leave it at journalists here. And we've got, in the case of the Mehmet Altan and Nazlı Ilıcak case, that's the most striking example of the misuse of charges perhaps we've seen against journalists so far, because they actually got, convicted at first instant court and at second appeal court, at the local court of appeal, of basically, participating in the coup in some way. Now, a very good thing, and I think I need to say this, is that the Court of Cassation's chief prosecutor is actually calling for that charge to be changed and says they should have been put on trial for aiding and abetting a terrorist organization. Now, it's unclear to me that they aided and abetted a terrorist organization on the basis of the evidence that we've seen so far. However, that's a great improvement. And it means that if the Court of Cassation does go ahead and overturn the conviction, which we really hope it does, then they should be let out of prison. Ilıcak and Ahmet Altan should be let out of prison very soon. So that's, there's been that one hopeful sign this year of maybe a change in thinking on their case. But of course, there are so many other cases coming up as well, and that doesn't provide a remedy in general to this, entrenched problem.
Another profession which has been damaged by the emergency rule and by its consequences, the lawyers and people who exist to defend people at the courts. The number you've been given in the report is that human rights lawyers are among over 1,500 lawyers on trial on terrorism charges at the time of writing. So the dramatic dimension of that hasn't changed, if not become worse.
Indeed. And I think we are looking very closely at the moment in a separate report that we're preparing. We're working on the issue of lawyers who are targeted by being associated very often with the crimes of their clients, the alleged crimes of their clients, which is something that should never happen. No lawyer should be associated with the client's crimes. And lawyers, every client, every suspect has the right to legal defense, has the right to a defense in court, and a right to legal counsel. And these very fundamental rights have been eroded over the last 2 years, very fundamentally. We've seen basically changes made through state of emergency decrees, which then got passed into law, to the Criminal Procedure Code, and also to the law on the execution of sentences. Now, these basically the lawyer's role in Turkey, the defense lawyer's role, has been eroded. And along with this erosion of the role of the lawyer, where they're given a diminished part in trials in many ways, you also see alongside that lawyers themselves are targeted. And we've seen lawyers imprisoned, we've seen lawyers finding themselves convicted of terrorism membership. And this goes across the political spectrum. Again, probably the vast majority of the cases do apply to lawyers who are associated in some way with the Gulen movement and are charged with FETÖ membership. But then we also see lots of Kurdish lawyers or lawyers who've acted for Kurdish clients or leftist clients also targeted and imprisoned.
Another point to look at is, of course, what happened to, and it's a new trend perhaps in 2018 that we have seen, is the growing crackdown on human rights defenders and prominent civil society figures. Amnesty International, top figure in Turkey, Taner Kılıç, and also a businessman, a philanthropist, well-known figure in civil society in Turkey, Osman Kavala, has been held in pretrial detention. That's a new trend, isn't it? I mean, the civil society, people who defend human rights internationally and on national level are also under attack.
Yes, I think that trend, there have been signs of that trend in the past. It's not entirely new in Turkey, but it's certainly accelerated rapidly after the coup in 2016, where, first of all, they started by closing down a lot of associations. The government closed down many associations, not many of them connected with human rights directly, but some of them connected with human rights. And I would note among that the Contemporary Lawyers Association, other lawyers associations as well, Gündem Children's Association. And then after that, there was a trend to go after defenders. And we saw that with the trial against the defenders who met for a human rights workshop on Büyükada and were detained. And we saw it in the trial against Taner Kılıç, which got combined with that trial. That's the Amnesty honorary chair. And it was good that Taner Kılıç was released from prison last year, but on the other hand, Osman Kavala has been in pre-trial detention for 14 months at present. I mean, coming up for 14 months. So, or over 14 months actually. So Osman Kavala has no indictment against him. He's now, it looks like, being investigated for the Gezi protests, which happened more than 5.5 years ago in 2013. And it's very hard, I think, to understand what Osman Kavala could possibly be charged for. Could one man possibly have organized the mass Gezi protests that happened in Istanbul and then spread to other cities, which were a phenomenon of 2013, over pretty quickly. But it's very hard to imagine logically such protests could have been organized, as the government is claiming they were in lots of statements in its media.
Mm-hmm. I have two more questions before we finish. About the torture, which also a report touches upon. How has it become systematic again? What's the situation of the prisoners?
There are different categories here with respect to abuse in detention. One is police custody. We've certainly seen a rise in abuse in police custody. We've documented that. The great difficulty is that it's very hard to prove it, because basically many doctors are not providing medical reports showing that people have been ill-treated. There are lots of ways to bypass the system so that you actually, there is no evidence or no paper trail of evidence to prove, to support the defendants' suggestion that they've been tortured. The other question is prison. Very difficult to monitor prison for NGOs because we're not allowed into prisons. But we do hear of a lot of reports through lawyers who visit their clients that there is ill treatment in prisons from time to time. I think overall it's hard to say how widespread and systematic the problem of abuse in detention, ill treatment and torture in detention is. But we have had reports of some very striking and very severe cases. And it clearly is an area that needs to be tackled. And so far we've seen, as far as we can, we've documented no proper investigations going on into these allegations, which many suspects are repeating when they come to court. They're saying that they were ill-treated. And the trouble, as we've pointed out to government authorities, there's every justification to put people on trial for the coup and for egregious crimes, and they should do that. They have a responsibility to do that, to bring the coup perpetrators to justice. However, if trials are overshadowed with allegations of torture, this discredits the process, and it's not in the interest of the government to allow that to happen.
In the Human Rights Watch report, this is written, the 2-year state of emergency formally lapsed, OHAL, as it's called in short in Turkish. It lapsed in July 2018, but was replaced with new counter-terrorism legislation approved by Parliament in August. The legislation contains many measures similar to the extraordinary powers to authorities enjoyed under emergency rule. They include widening already broad powers of appointed provincial governors to restrict assemblies and movement, executive authority for 3 years to dismiss public officials, including judges, by administrative decision, and increased police powers, including custody periods extendable for up to 12 days. So in short, and in plain English, this means that emergency rule has been sort of transferred or downloaded into regular legislation. So is it fair to say that state of emergency de facto continues in Turkey?
I think there's a normalization of emergency powers is how I would put it. And I think where we see this most strikingly is in relation to decisions to ban demonstrations, public assemblies. In Ankara, for example, the Ankara governor's ban on all LGBT events and organizations, public meetings and public workshops and so forth are banned, and they are indefinitely banned. And that continues, and there's no justification for that. But that continues. In Istanbul, we've seen the Saturday Mothers demonstration, which went on, very peaceful vigil every Saturday outside Galatasaray Lycée, at the same place for many, many years. We've seen that very arbitrarily banned from happening at that location. And these are the kinds of powers that are being used to give the message to the population that, you cannot go out onto the streets. Whether you're doing a peaceful vigil or a public meeting, we will decide when and where you can do it, or if you can do it. And we won't provide any reason for why it's a public threat or a security issue, but we'll just literally ban it. This is a demonstration of, it gives the message we have the power to ban, and we will ban as we want. And that's a very, very, it's a very sinister and oppressive way of proceeding, which sends out a message more broadly that, don't protest, don't raise your voices. We don't want to hear your criticism.
Ms. Sinclair-Webb, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Our guest at Temporal, part of our News podcast series, was Ms. Emma Sinclair-Webb, Turkey Director of Human Rights Watch, which issued its annual report yesterday. And we focused on the developments on this area in Turkey. You can follow Ahval News at ahvalnews.com. And hope to meet again. Thank you.